looks like we just hit the hour, so it's time to get started. And like the slide says, today we're going to be demystifying DX. And so by the end of this class, you'll know everything about the different DX stage boxes that are available to you, the DX protocol and how it works, and all the different ways that you can connect DX and all the ways that you should not connect DX, because it's a very simple protocol, and therefore you don't want to get too complicated. And you'll know that there are different ports and there's different ways that DX behaves depending on how you're connecting it, and you'll learn all about that today. So let's dive right into it. So first of all, what is DX? So it's a 32 by 32 proprietary Allen Heath protocol. So that means when you see a DX port on your system, like on a DLive stagebox, for example, that can send a maximum of 32 outputs from the console, and it can also receive a maximum of 32 inputs from the stagebox to the console. So that's 32 by 32 bidirectional for that DX port. It's a proprietary Allen Heath protocol, which means that it's not really something that that you would kind of put alongside other things on a network. There are ways to use this on a basic kind of network switch, but we won't really go into that today. That gets a bit advanced. DX is only used for expansion of I/O. So if you see a DX port on a stage box or on your console, that can't be used for a digital split. You can't connect like an SQ to the DX port of a DLive. That would not work. So just remember that when you see a DX port, that's only for DX stage boxes and nothing else. And DX is compatible with SQ, DLive, Avantis, and AHM series mixers. And on the right, you'll see a DLive S5000, I believe, being used at monitors. And there's also one at front of house for George Thorogood. And he's currently on a great tour right now. And there's an article about that you can read all about. It's on my LinkedIn if you're looking for it. And so here's an overview of all the different DX hardware. So in the top is the classic DX168. It's 16 line inputs, 8 line outputs, or mic inputs, excuse me. You'll see that it has a handle and 4 kind of rubber feet on it because it's kind of meant as a portable stage box that you can kind of throw on the stage anywhere, but it also comes, you can also order a 19-inch rack mount kit. So if you wanted to just have that permanently mounted somewhere, you could do that as well. DX164W, it's 16 in, 4 out, and that's meant to be kind of mounted flush with a wall or in a floor pocket on stage, so meant for more installations. DX012, that's only 12 outputs. The first 4 XLR outputs you see are just standard analog XLR outs, and then the other 8 have switches on them. Each group of 4, you could switch them to instead be stereo AES outputs instead of analog mono outputs. So that's a really neat option if you're looking for adding additional outputs. Say like if you have an SQ and you're doing a bunch of stereo IEMs, you can just add a DX012, put it on stage, and that will give you 12 additional XLR outputs or AES outputs if you needed to feed your IEM system. So when you really need to build up your outputs, that's a great way to add some. And then DX32, that one's a bit more complicated. We're going to have a whole slide on that later, but basically it's a 32 by 32 modular DX stage box, and you'll see that there's 4 card slots on it, and there are different card options. So there's an 8-channel analog input card, 8-channel analog output card. Then there's AES stereo with 4 inputs or 4 output cards. And there's also prime cards, which you'll see later as well. So that's just an overview of all the different DX stage boxes you have. So first of all, when you're connecting DX to a DX port, so on a DLive console, you'll see DX ports. You also see it on DX hubs, which we'll look at later, and on certain stage boxes have additional DX outputs. So when you see a DX port, you can cascade up to 2 DX168s, 2 DX164Ws, or 2 DX012s, or any combination of those 2. So you could have a 168 to an 012, 012 to a 168, 012 to a 164. That's up to you. But those I'm calling half DX in quotation marks, because remember that DX is a 32-channel protocol, and each of those only really goes up to a maximum of 16. So that means you can cascade them, and that will add up to the full 32 capacity of the DX port. With the DX32, however, that's already 32 by 32 channels. You can have like up to 32 inputs on it if you put the appropriate input cards. So when you put a DX32 on a DX port, that maxes out the port, and you can't daisy chain further DXs off of it. So keep that in mind. They're 168, 164, and 012, those are kind of half a port, and you could daisy chain them. And with the DX32, that takes up the entire port. And we're looking at, in the top right, this is actually a C-class D-Live mix rack. And so you'll notice that it goes from DX1 to DX3. And the reason for that is on D-Live S-class, we have the option of redundancy. And so you'll see that when you move to a DM48, this is an S-class D-Live mix rack, we have DX1 and DX2, and then DX3 and DX4. And you can't actually use these independently. These are redundant pairs. And so that means that you can connect a single stage box with two separate connections, because each DX stage box has both an A and a B port. And when you're daisy chaining them, you'll go from the DX port to the A, and then the B to the A of the next stage box. But when you're using it in redundant mode, you're going from DX1 to the A port and DX2 to the B port. And basically how this works is if the A port, if there's like a rat chewing on your cable and the cable goes out, it will seamlessly switch over to the B connection, and you won't hear any stopping in the audio. So this is great if you have an installation or a tour and you absolutely cannot have your audio drop out or fail, like you're doing, say, like a presidential address or something that's super important. You cannot have the audio fail. You can have redundancy with a D-Live S-class system, and this will give you kind of that backup in case there's ever a cable issue or any kind of issue with one of the ports or anything like that. So this is really useful, but keep in mind that when you're doing redundancy like this, like I said, the B port and the A port are both connecting back to the console, which means that you can't daisy chain. So even though we can put like a DX168 here and we have the capacity for 32 channels, because both of those connections are being used for redundancy, we can't daisy chain a second one. So by using redundancy, you're kind of reducing the total amount of stage boxes that you can connect to a system. To have redundancy and chain them, you need to, so if you have redundancy and you want to use more stage boxes, then you'll need additional cards or additional places to connect DXs. And we're going to go over a lot more, Dayton, a lot more ways to connect DX. And you'll see that even with redundancy, you still have a lot of expansion options. So now let's look at a DX hub. This is one of those options. So basically, the way I like to think about a DX hub is a GigaAce to DX converter. You can't connect a DX stage box directly to a GigaAce port. It just won't work that way. So when you add an intermediate DX hub, you'll notice that a DX hub here has a GigaAce input and output, and this connects back to a GigaAce card on, say, a D-Live or an Avantis console. And then that gives you 4 separate 32-channel DX ports. And I'm really, really proud of this animation that I made. So you'll see that we have GigaAce that's kind of 128 channels, so it's 4 times 32, but we're splitting that up into 4 separate 32-channel blocks. And each of these DX ports here, these will handle a certain range of DX sockets. So now that we've switched our 128 channels of GigaAce into DX, this port is going to handle DX channels 1 to 32. This is going to handle DX channels 33 to 64. This is 65 to 96, and this is 97 to 128. And so it's important to note that a DX hub it looks like a network switch, but it's not just a normal network switch, because each port is handling a specific range of input and output sockets on your GigaAce card now. Oh, thanks, Jason. I appreciate it. Yeah, I put a lot of work into that animation, so I'm really glad you appreciated it. So yeah, basically a DX hub, that's the way I like to think about it, is a GigaAce to DX converter, and it splits it up into different blocks of 32 input and output sockets on your GigaAce card. And so you might be asking yourself, how do we do redundancy if we have DX hubs? And the way to do it is using 2 DX hubs. So you'll see that a GigaAce card that you install in your Avantis or DLive has an A and a B port. And these aren't meant to connect to two separate things. They're meant for redundancy only. So if the A port is going to a DX hub and that's connecting to your various stage boxes, you can connect the B port to a second hub, and then that can go to the B ports of all your stage boxes. And it's the same concept. If one of these cables goes out on the A hub, it will switch over seamlessly to the B, and then you won't hear any dropouts in audio, and you'll have that full redundancy. And so you could, sleep safe with that. Make sure that all of your stage boxes are set to redundant mode, because every DX stage box has this switch between cascade, where you're daisy chaining, and redundant, which means that the B port is being kind of used as a backup for the A port. And keep in mind, again, because this is redundant, we can't daisy chain an additional DX168 or 012 or 164, because both the A and B ports are being used for our redundancy. And by the way, I'm kind of putting DX32s and 168s or whatever here, but it's important to note that all of these are interchangeable. It doesn't really matter which one you use where and which connects to which port. What matters is that you're just consistent. So 1 and 1 are both going to the same stage box, and 2 and 2 are going to the same stage box, and so on. Okay. So now let's look at the DX Link card. And this is a great way, Dayton, again, of adding more DX ports to your system. So if you have a DLive or Avantis, a DX Link is a card that that can go into the I/O ports, either on your DLive mix rack, on the back of your DLive Surface, or on the back of your Avantis. And this gives you 4 separate DX ports. And each port is just like a standard DX port. It handles 32 channels. And you see these little white lines here that usually, when you think back to the DLive S class, that usually refers to redundancy. But with DX Link, you actually have the option within the console. You can have these operate in redundant mode, or you can have them each be independent. So depending on how many stage boxes you want to connect and how important redundancy is to you, you can disable the redundant pairs here and just treat each port independently. So each one can handle a daisy chain of DX168s or a single DX32. So that's really important to note, because it looks like these are redundant pairs, but they don't have to be if you don't need and want them to be. And I just want to clarify, SQ is involved here. We're going to see some about SQ later on, I promise. I just want to make a note here, because people often confuse the DX Link and DX Hub. So DX Link is a card that you install in your DLive or Avantis console, and that gives you 4 DX ports. And DX Hub is an external device that connects back to a GigaAce port that gives you those 4 DX ports externally. So that's really, really important to note. These two devices are often confused with each other, but they're related because they look similar, but they're actually very different. DX Hub is an external device, and DX Link is a card that's installed. Sorry, Carl, you had a question. You want flexible connectivity. Oh, okay. Well, you'll see, Carl, by the end of this, I'm sure you'll have the answer to your question, because all of these are different options really for connecting DX stage boxes all over the place. So if you had a DX Link card, you can distribute DX stage boxes all over the place. If you have a DLive, you already have some built-in DX ports that you can use for distribution, and a DX Hub as well can be used for that if you have a GigaAce card installed. So now we're going to get into SQ. So Dayton, here's what you were looking for. So on SQ, you have a built-in S-Link port, and the same on Avantis. And SQ also has a card slot where you can add an S-Link card, and AHM as well has a card slot for S-Link or an S-Link port on an AHM64. And it's important to note that an S-Link port is kind of like a chameleon. Depending on what you connect to it, it can behave differently. So you can connect a DX stage box directly to it, and then it will behave just like a DX port. It can go up to 32 channels. So you could put 2 DX168s or a DX168 to an 012 or 164W to a 168, whatever you want, or a single DX32, and then it's just operating like a normal DX port. You can also connect a DX Hub to an S-Link port, and then it behaves like GigaAce. So you actually have 128 channels. So if you really want to max out the use of your S-Link port, you can connect a DX Hub to it, and now you can connect up to 8 DX168s to your SQ's S-Link port, because each of these ports can daisy chain up to 2 DX168s off of it. So this is the same for the built-in S-Link port or an S-Link card. depending on what you connect to it, it will behave differently. If you're just connecting DX stage boxes, you're not getting the full 128 channels out of it. It's just taking 32 in and 32 out. So this is just a way to kind of maximize, depending on your needs. Some people obviously won't need to go higher than 32 channels plus the local inputs on the back of your SQ. But if you do need more connection points and you need more channels and more options, adding a DX hub will give you that additional flexibility and more expandability. Now let's take a bit of a deeper dive into DX32. So we went over these modules before, but I'll just, you now have a closer look at them. So here's 8 analog inputs, 8 analog outputs, 4 stereo AES inputs, 4 stereo AES outputs, and then you can really use any combination of these. So if you wanted 32 inputs, you can put 4 of these cards here, 4 of the 8 analog input cards, and that gives you 32 inputs. Same with, you could do 32 outputs if you wanted, or a bunch of AES inputs, a bunch of AES outputs. And then there's also the optional redundant PSU. So the same way we talked about redundancy earlier, where if the A fails, it goes over to the B. You can also, every DX32 has one power supply built in, but it has a slot for a second one. Here, this DX32 has a second one installed. And same thing, if there's some issue with the power, if somebody steps on the cable and unplugs it, whatever happens, it will switch over seamlessly to the second power supply and keep everything running without dropping audio. And then you, of course, have the prime inputs and outputs. So these were added later, and these kind of give you much, much higher quality. Like these are already very high quality. These are the D-Live preamps. So these are already very high quality converters and high quality preamps. And then the prime cards, actually, like these ones are 24-bit and these ones are 32-bit converters. So when you're taking your 96K samples per second, you're now taking much higher resolution samples because it's using 32 bits every time it samples versus 24 bits. So just think about that higher resolution, higher dynamic range, and just higher overall quality, because these are meant to also reduce noise. You could really crank up the gain on these and get much higher resolution without adding additional noise to it. So you can learn a lot more about the prime input cards. I won't go too much into them, but these are just additional options that can be installed in a DX32. And again, you can have any combination of prime input and output, and these standard analog input and output, and AES input and output. These are all just options for the DX32 slots. And Alex, you brought up a great point. We're going to talk about that right now. Actually, the GX4816 also has DX ports on it. And the way I like to think about the GX4816 is that it's kind of like a DX hub. It has kind of a DX hub built into it. And if you think about, I'm doing another cool animation, guys, get ready. So GigaAce is 128 channels, and the GX port connects back to GigaAce. So it's really using GigaAce to connect back to your console. So it has 128 channels to work with. And here's our cool animation. So the first 2 blocks are being used for those preamps on the GX4816 for the analog inputs and outputs. And then the other 2 blocks are being used for the DX ports here. And so that's why when you connect a GX4816 to your system, and then you go into the I/O screen and you start assigning sockets, anything that you connect to this DX port actually starts at socket 65. And that's because the 2 first blocks of 32 are being used by the analog inputs and outputs. And so this is 32, 1 to 32, and then this is 33 to 64. And so when you start connecting things here, that starts at 65. It's like the equivalent of port number 3 on a DX hub and port number 4 on a DX hub. And so they could have theoretically had this be a GX 64 or 16, I guess. They could have done up to 64 because they have 64 channels to work with. But for whatever reason, I guess because of the needs of most customers and to keep costs down, they kept it to 48 inputs. But it really goes up to 60. It's really going up to 64 in terms of using GigaAce sockets, and that's why these ones start at 65. What about the other port? So this GX port is what goes back to the console. So it connects back to a GigaAce card on a D-Live or Avantis, or it can go back to an S-Link port on an Avantis or SQ or AHM. That's what this port is. So GX is kind of like GigaAce expansion. You can kind of think about it that way. And like Alex said, this second DX port can also connect ME stage boxes. So it's kind of like the S-Link port where depending on what you connect to it, it'll behave differently. If you connect a DX stage box to it, then you can do up to 32 channels of DX, so 2 DX168s or a DX32 or any combination of those half DX boxes. But if you connect an MEU or an ME1 or an ME500, then it will output 40 channels of ME, and you can use it for personal monitoring. So it's a great option for SQ if you want all of your inputs and outputs on stage, and then you also want additional expansion for DX and connect your MEs all in one place. So it's a great kind of central hub for an SQ or an Avantis system. So that's kind of an overview of GX4816. And I just want to stress this. This is a fully expanded D-Live S-class system because on the back of the surface, we have 2 card slots. On the D-Live mix rack and S-class mix rack, we have 3 card slots. So if you put DX link cards in all of those card slots and connected as many DX168s as we could, that's up to 46 DX168s that we can connect to a D-Live S-class system. That gives you 736 additional mic preamps and 368 additional line outputs. So you could really, really get fancy with this. And you could do the same thing for SQ or for Avantis or whatever. Just put DX link cards in all of your card slots or put DX hubs in none of your S-Link ports. And that gives you so much expansion with DX protocols. And it's very simple. It's not like Dante where you have to have a very complicated network. It's very plug and play and easy to set up, and it really expands your system. And I would like to stress that if you feel like you're not going to remember a lot of the stuff, it's a lot of information we just went through. If you go to the Allen Heath website and then go to either Avantis or SQ or D-Live and then go to the documents section, there's the DX and GX system guide, and that will explain a lot more about, well, it'll basically go over a lot of the same stuff that we talked about today, but it's good to have that as a reference in case you're doing a setup and you want to make sure if something's compatible or how expandable your system is. So Carl, what about the length on DX Cat5e? So it's 100 meters or about 330 feet. Yes, you should use shielded cables, and we recommend using locking connectors as well, so they're not so fragile and they can't easily be removed from just like pulled out. And also, yes, they should be shielded. And the 100 meter or 330 feet limit is every time you add a node to that. So if you add a DX168, you can do another 100 meters off of that to the next DX168. And if you add a DX hub before that, you can go from your console to the DX hub, that's 100 meters, then go from the hub to the first DX168, that's another 100 meters, then go from that DX168 to a second one, it's another 100 meters. So if you have really, really far away connections, you don't necessarily need to go to fiber to get those really far lengths. You can use like multiple nodes, and kind of those add up to be really, really far away from the initial console. Any additions with multiple connections in line? So if I understand your question correctly, Carl, are you talking about like going through like a network switch and then connecting 2 DX168s for that? Floor boxes. You'll have to clarify exactly what you're asking, Carl. EtherCon. Yeah, so if I understand, like some people have like the DX port on their console will go to kind of like a standard, if it's just like a standard dumb layer 2 network switch, and you have multiple connection points for the same stage box, yes, that's totally fine. You could do that. You can go from the DX port to like a network switch, have that branch out to multiple kind of pockets on stage, and then you can carry your DX168 around and connect it to any of those pockets. As long as you don't connect to 2 of those pockets simultaneously, then you're okay. You can connect them in parallel. But if you just have multiple connection points and you're only using one at a time, then that's totally fine. And there's my view of the lake from the weekend. If anyone has any other questions, put them in the chat. Any loss per connection? Yeah, that's why I would recommend using a network switch, because I think it handles those multiple connections better. If you're just talking about like a passive kind of splitting of EtherCon, I wouldn't really recommend that. Any other questions about DX or GX? or has it been completely demystified for all of you? You guys have put some great questions in the chat today. I like how active it is. Okay, well, I'll stick around for a little bit. Thank you everyone for joining, and I hope that you now have a better understanding of DX and GX. And remember to look for that DX and GX system guide if you have further questions, because that goes a bit more in depth on each of these topics, and also the networking side, Carl. It's a good way. So if you weren't taking notes today, then that's a great way to kind of have like a summary of everything in one kind of PDF sheet. So that's really useful for any of you installers who are looking to expand your system, or if you're initially setting up a system and want multiple connection points everywhere. So I hope that was helpful to everyone. If there's any questions, pop them in the chat, and I'll stick around for a little bit.